We have all at one point or another used the phrase, "It's the greatest thing since sliced bread." You know it. But do you know the history of the phrase? For those of you that are visiting this morning, you'll learn fairly quickly that I offer all kinds of trivia free of charge. You get that just coming, and this morning, this is one of those things. There was a man by the name of Otto Frederick Roeder, I suppose, German. He was from Davenport, Iowa. He was an inventor and an engineer. His first career, however, was as a jeweler. He owned 3 jewelry stores, which he sold in order to create and manufacture an automated bread slicer. So in 1917, as he was working on this in a factory that he had rented some space in, a fire broke out in that factory, and it destroyed the first prototype and all of the blueprints that he had been working on. And so that set him back about another 10 years, and it wasn't until 1927 when he successfully designed a machine that not only sliced the bread, but also wrapped it as well. He applied for patents to protect his invention, and he sold his first one to a friend and baker by the name of Frank Bench. And Frank installed that first machine at the Chillicothe Baking Company in Chillicothe, Missouri. Some say Chillicothe, Missouri. In 1928, the first loaf of sliced bread sold commercially was on July the 7th of 1928. The bread was advertised as the greatest forward step in the baking industry since bread was wrapped. But my favorite story of sliced bread comes from 1943. This was new to me. I just thought it was very fascinating just because I like that period of time and history. The United States imposed a short-lived ban on sliced bread. Who would have known? In support of the military measures that were being taken at the time. And on January 26th, 1943, this letter appeared in the New York Times from a distraught housewife. "I should like to let you know how important sliced bread is to the morale and the saneness of this household. My husband and our 4 children are all in a rush during and after breakfast. Without ready sliced bread, I must do the slicing for toast. 2 pieces for each one, that's 10. For their lunches, I must cut by hand at least 20 slices for two sandwiches apiece. Afterward, I make my own toast, 22 slices of bread to be cut in a hurry." Now, the reason that I love that story is because I have this image in my head of a Washington politician or businessman sitting at his desk, and this grin comes across his face as he thinks to himself, "Man, my boss is really going to love this. I'll save the country thousands in the midst of war," only to have this idea quickly sunk by a housewife with an apron around herself cutting these pieces of bread at home. And to me, that's just a wonderful image of just the brilliance on the one hand by the practicality on the other. A writer from the Kansas City Star said, "The phrase, 'the greatest thing since sliced bread,' is the ultimate depiction of innovative achievement and American know-how." Well, this morning I want us to see what Jesus can do with bread and some fish before it's sliced, before it's packaged. So I'd ask you to take your copy of God's Word and turn with me to John chapter 6. John chapter 6 is a unique chapter, especially the verses that we're going to look at this morning. What you have here is the only miracle recorded in all 4 Gospels outside of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Of course, all of the Gospels record Jesus' resurrection, but the only other miracle that all of them recount for us is the feeding of the 5,000. You find it in Matthew 14, in Mark 6, I believe, Luke chapter 9, and then here in John 6. And one of the questions that you have to ask yourself, or at least one of the questions that I ask, and I ask it for you, is why? Why this miracle and not the water being turned to wine? Why this miracle and not Jesus walking on the water? Why this miracle and not the man at the pool of Bethesda like we saw last week? Why this miracle? Well, I suppose that there are a number of reasons, but let me just offer this as one possibility. I think it's because that the miracle story, feeding 5,000, bears so much theological and spiritual significance that each of the gospel writers knew and could employ. See if you'll follow me here. If you go to Matthew, Mark, and Luke's account of this story, they all speak about this taking place in a desolate, deserted place. The Greek word there is eremos. It's the word from which we get our English word arid. Obviously speaking of a very dry, desert-like place, but it also means wilderness. Now stop and think about this for a moment. Jesus is in a wilderness place. Who else was in a wilderness place? Moses. Moses was in a wilderness place, and who was with Moses in the wilderness place? The Hebrews, the Jews. Who's with Jesus in this desert place? The Jews, Hebrews. Moses is depending on God to rain down bread from heaven, rain down manna to feed the people. What's Jesus going to do? He's going to take bread and a few fish and feed the people as well. Later in John chapter 6, you'll hear Jesus say this: Moses didn't give you the bread from heaven. Rather, my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who came down from heaven and gives life to the world. So what you have here at the feeding of the 5,000 is a look back to the Old Testament, and what you essentially have theologically is someone greater than Moses. Now, if you go to Matthew 14, you're going to read that the people were seated in grass. If you go to Mark and his gospel, he's going to tell you that they were sitting in green grass. And here in John chapter 6, they're sitting in the grass. Does that bring up another image in your mind? The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. There beside the Sea of Galilee, sitting in grass. And so there's another theological image here of someone greater than David. Now listen, later in John, we're going to see this. We're told in verse 4 of John that the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near. What happened at the Passover? Well, you took a Passover lamb, you sacrificed that lamb, and at the first Passover, they took the blood of that Passover lamb, they put it over the lintel, over the doorpost, and down the frames of the door, and they went in so that the angel of death would pass over those that were under the blood of that sacrificial lamb, and that family would go in and they would partake of the lamb that they sacrificed in that first Passover. Later in John 6, we're going to hear Jesus say this about himself, who is the Passover lamb. He's going to say this: I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in him. Now, we can talk about exactly what that passage means later, but the point is this: here is the Passover lamb that will shed his blood in sacrifice to keep us from eternal death and give us life. So there is one greater than Moses. There's one greater than David, and there's one who is the true, real, sacrificial lamb, all right here at the feeding of the 5,000. And we haven't even gotten to the story yet. So there's a theological significance, there's a spiritual significance, but today I want us to see the practical significance. And the first thing that I want us to notice is that Jesus isn't concerned about the amount. Look at verses 5 and 6. Of John chapter 6. Then Jesus lifted up his eyes and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, where shall we buy bread that these may eat? But this he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. You know, people oftentimes ask me why the Bible doesn't have any humor in it. You know, if Jesus is fully God and fully man, then why don't we see a humorous scene? Maybe Jesus telling a joke. If Jesus is this fun-loving guy, then why don't we have his disciples bending over in laughter somewhere in the text? And it's a good question to ask. My serious answer to that is that the humor there is humor in the Bible, unfortunately, the humor of sinful man isn't humorous to a holy and pure God. And so what is given to us in the Scriptures doesn't resonate with us as humor because our humor is so far afield from what it should be. But I think there's humor here in this passage, and I'll show it to you in just a moment. If we could only place ourselves in this scene, if we could only sense and hear things the way that were intended. One of my family's favorite Christmas movies is the movie Elf with Will Ferrell. How many of you have seen Elf? Go ahead, admit your sin right here in church. It's a good movie. It's got some language in it, but it's a good Christmas movie. We love that movie. There's a scene in that movie. Will Ferrell plays this elf by the name of Buddy. Buddy is an adult-sized elf. He's the only one at the North Pole that doesn't realize that he's not like everybody else. And in the opening scenes of that movie, he's in a room and he's testing Jack in the Boxes. Do you remember this scene? And the tune is playing, da-ding, 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 da-ding. You know, he's turning the handle. We all know what's coming, and he finds one that doesn't pop up. And so he turns to go and write that in his notes, and all of a sudden, you know, it pops open, and he gets mad and throws everything down. And that's kind of what I see happening here. And you say, gee, Pastor, that was a stretch. How did you get from Elf to feeding the 5,000? Well, here's an ocean of people. 5,000 men, not counting, according to the other Gospels, women and children. 5,000, some scholars say as many as 15 to 20,000 people. You've got an ocean of people, and all of their little beady eyes, like little cartoon characters, are glued to the disciples and Jesus. And I picture Jesus with a slight grin on his face, seeing this massive humanity, turn to his friend Philip and say, hey, Philip, where are we going to buy food for all of these little bird mouths that are staring at us? Can you just see Philip? And his eyes kind of begin to grow wide, and he swallows kind of deeply. In that moment, things begin circling in his head, and all the while, Jesus' grin turns into a full-blown smile and then a hearty laugh. And I picture Philip standing there, hey, Jesus, you know, what's so funny? I'm being serious. What's so funny? Jesus, would you stop laughing and tell me, listen, 200 denarii couldn't feed all these. Jesus, stop laughing. It's kind of humorous when you begin to think about it. And yet, here's the sad thing, that most of the time, you and I are just like Philip. Most of the time, we're more concerned about a spreadsheet than we are with people. Most of the time, we're concerned about a budget rather than people. Most of the time, we're parsing prices and percentages and decimal points rather than ministering to people. Folks, Jesus doesn't see you as a number. Jesus doesn't see people as dollar signs. Jesus isn't just looking at you as a figure on his eternal spreadsheet. Jesus isn't concerned about the amount of people that are there. He's concerned about the individuals that make up the amount of people that are there. Listen to how Mark describes this in Mark chapter 6. And Jesus, when he came out, saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion for them because they were like sheep not having a shepherd. It's not about buildings. It's not about brick. It's not about mortar. It's not about numbers. It's not about bottom line. It's about people. Jesus calls us to join him in mission. I was meeting with a small group of men this past week, and as so often is the case, we were discussing some issues that plague our nation and plague our world. And one of the things that we recognized as we were talking about this and trying to figure out how we individually fit into this is so many of the things that you and I see on the news are huge. I mean, they're global issues. And we just kind of walk away from the newspaper or the internet or the news broadcast and we say, how can I be in? It's just too big. And it's important to know what's going on in our country and in the world today, but the danger is that we'll be overwhelmed by the size of the problem. We'll be overcome by the numbers to such a degree that we won't do anything. Philip sees an obstacle, but Jesus sees an opportunity. The second thing I want us to notice is that Jesus isn't concerned about the adequacy. Look at John 6, verses 7 through 9. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may have a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, there's a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, but what are they among so many? Did you notice the focus? There's this little boy. The King James Version calls him a lad. Who's out there? There's a crowd out there. Here are 5 barley loaves and what kind of fish? 2 small fish. Notice the end of verse 9. But what are they among so many? The Greek there is, what's this little stuff? What's this in measure of all of that? The emphasis is on the inadequacy of the offering. What's this little stuff going to do? And Andrew's response isn't much better than Philip. Now, granted, Andrew is the one that brings the little one to Jesus, and that's a sermon for another day. But Andrew essentially arrives at the same conclusion as Philip. Jesus, this can't be done. There's no way that this little bit can even feed the boy, much less this crowd. This is impossible. Jesus, this just can't be done. When you come across Moses in the Midian desert and God calls him out from the burning bush, you remember there that God says, hey, Moses, I want you to go to Pharaoh. I want you to tell him to let my people go. And what does Moses say? Can't do that, God. I can't speak. I can't stand in front of people. I stutter. I stammer. It's not possible for me to do anything like that. Think about Gideon, for example. The angel of the Lord comes to Gideon. Gideon's down in this hole. An angel of the Lord comes to him and says, I want you to lead God's people in a battle against the Midianites. And Gideon looks at him and says, you got to be kidding me. I'm from the most insignificant tribe. And furthermore, I'm from the most insignificant family in the most insignificant tribe. And if that weren't bad enough, I'm the youngest and I'm the most insignificant in the most insignificant family, in the most insignificant tribe. God, this just can't happen. This is just impossible. You come to Jeremiah and God tells Jeremiah that he wants him to speak on his behalf and preach to the people. And I love this. Listen to what Jeremiah says. Then I said, Lord God, behold, I cannot speak, for I am a youth. God, I'm a teenager. I can't do that. But the Lord said to me, do not say I'm a youth. Stop saying that. Stop telling me who you are. I created you. I'm God. I know who you are. I know what your gifts are. Stop telling me what you can and can't do. Watch this over in John chapter 15. You don't have to turn there. Jesus says, I'm the vine, you're the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you are right, you can't do one cotton picking thing. You remember what the Apostle Paul said when he was complaining about the thorn in his flesh? 3 times I pleaded with the Lord that it should leave me. But God said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. My grace is all that you need, for my power is made manifest. I am glorified. I am manifestly visible in your weakness, not in your strength. I don't show up in your adequacy. I show up in your inadequacy. I don't show up in your strength. I show up in your weaknesses. That doesn't sit well with us because we like to tell God what we're good at. God, this is what I'm good at. God, this is what you ought to be doing with me. If you just listen, I can tell you how much I can handle and when I can handle it and what I'm going to do with it. God, if you just listen to me, I'll be more than happy to tell you what I'm good at. It reminds me of a story that John Walker told me last week. He was maybe 4 years old. We were standing there at the door as he was leaving. A telemarketer called us home one day. Little Johnny was answered the phone in a hushed whisper. Hello. Hello, what's your name? Well, how old are you, Johnny? I'm 4. Well, good. Is your mother home? Yeah, but she's busy. Okay, is your father home? He's busy too. Well, I see. Is there anybody else there? The police. The police. Can I speak with one of them? They're busy. Well, are there any other grown-ups there? The firemen. May I speak with one of the firemen, please, Johnny? Johnny, are you okay? What's going on? They're all busy. Johnny, all those people in your house, and I can't talk with any of them, what are they doing? Looking for me. You see, that's exactly what we do with God. What did Adam and Eve do with God in the garden? They did little Johnny, did they not? They hid from him. God, if I don't talk about it, if I don't think about it, if I don't come to the altar, if I don't bring it up, if I don't deal with my weaknesses and the issues in my life, my fear of sharing, my fear of giving, my fear of trusting, my fear of walking, if I don't look at it, if I just don't face it, it'll just all go away. No, it doesn't. Listen, folks, until and unless we confess our weaknesses to God, our strengths will never matter. Jesus isn't concerned about the amount. He's not concerned about the adequacy, but he is concerned about our availability. Jesus is going on to say here in John chapter 6, between verses 9 and 10, something that you're going to miss that you have to flip back over to Matthew 14 to get. He doesn't say it in John 6. You have to flip over to Matthew 14 to pick it up. So hold your finger here in John 6. Flip back over with me to Matthew chapter 14. I'm going to begin in Matthew 14 and verse 14. And we're going to find something that's in Matthew's account of the same story that's missing from John, but it's so important. Matthew 14, beginning in verse 14 and going on. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them, and he healed their sick. Now, when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the hour is now over. Send the crowds away to go into the village and buy food for themselves." But Jesus said, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "You've got to be kidding. We only have 5 loaves here and 2 fish." Now, this is the part I want you to hear. And Jesus said, "Bring them here to me." There it is. There's your invitation. Bring it to me. Jesus says, every single one of us, whatever your limitation is, bring it to me. Do you ever really expect to be used of God? You bring it to him. You can't be used until you respond to the invitation. Bring it to me. Jesus says, bring to me whatever it is that you think you can't do. Now look back over in John chapter 6. Andrew brings this little boy with 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. And what's interesting is this little boy doesn't say to Jesus, "Hey, Jesus, here's the thing. This guy came and got me. He says you need what I have. Let's split it. You take 2.5 loaves and a fish. I'll take 2.5 loaves. It's mine. I mean, come on. Let's just split it down the middle." That's not what he does. He doesn't do that. He brings it all. But I want you to notice the emphasis. I've already touched on the seeming inadequacy, the smallness of it. But notice here the focus is on the quality. Let me tell you what the mother of this little boy likely did. She probably took some figs, mashed those figs up, and probably put a little bit of honey in those figs and continued to mix that up until she had a mash. And then she would get barley. And barley was the cheapest kind of grain that you could get. Did any of you grow up in... Sue, what did you feed horses when you were in the country? Sweet feed. That's what this mama made for her son. Some sweet feed. She put all that together, rolled it up into a little ball, and mashed it out into a little cake. Wasn't a loaf. Wasn't what you and I picture. It was this little cake. And then what she did is she found these 2 little fish. Fish about 3-4 inches long. They find them in the Sea of Galilee. She probably just, right there at the shores, just kind of seined them in a net and tossed them over into some salt that she got from the Dead Sea and pickled those fish there. So the little boy went out that day with something sweet and something salty. He was carrying first century trail mix. Something sweet and something salty, but it was poor quality. This wasn't tilapia. It wasn't Irish salmon. He didn't bring some 10 to 14 inch Arnold's whole grain double protein loaf. He brought that to Jesus. And what does Jesus do? He didn't turn his nose up at it. Jesus doesn't laugh at his disciples and say, guys, you got to be kidding me. He didn't say with a stern voice, you guys get that stuff out of here and get serious and go find me something that I can work with. He didn't do that. He did what he always does. He accepted it. Just like he accepts you. Just like he accepts me. Whoever you are, he accepts you just as you are. As little as you might be and as poor quality as you might be. Jesus accepts us as we are, and he takes us in his hand, and he does exceedingly and abundantly above all that we could ask or imagine. And you say, I don't have anything noteworthy to give. I don't have anything of significance to give. I'm not good enough. I'm not talented enough. I'm not gifted enough. I'm not polished enough. Listen, he's not concerned about the amount. He's not concerned about your adequacy. He's looking for your availability. He's concerned with your obedience. Let's pray.